Around 4 months ago, I completely switched up my opening repertoire, most notably swapping out the Caro-Kann defense for the Sicilian defense. In doing so, I have truly understood the value of learning multiple openings. Not only does it make you extremely unpredictable to play against, but openings often transpose into one another, which can help you find familiarity in otherwise unknown positions. But I wasn't just satisfied with learning one extra opening. So welcome to my new series where I study an opening so you don't have to. Today we'll be looking through the Catalan opening. We'll go through all of the important lines, and at the end I'll rate the opening based on 3 main categories. These categories are effectiveness, entertainment value, and theoretical difficulty. If you'd like to get a better understanding of how I studied this opening, check the video at the top of the description where I go through my study plan. Also, make sure you leave a comment letting me know what opening you'd like me to study. Whichever one is the top comment, we'll look at in the next video. So with that being said, let's take a look at Magnus Carlsen's favorite opening, the Catalan. The Catalan is an opening played with the white pieces and begins with the move d4. It's important to note that the Catalan should not be played as a systematic opening. For example, if d4 e5, we should most definitely not try and aim for a Catalan setup. We should then play the mainline Angland gambit, as it is extremely good for the white pieces. So for all purposes of this video, things that require you to play into their main line to have a good position won't be included in this repertoire. A full list of things we will look at in today's video is the open Catalan, closed Catalan, Slav defense, Semi-Slav defense, Tarrasch defense, Grunfeld defense, and the King's Indian defense. If you'd like to explore openings that we've left out that are still possible but technically not the Catalan, I've left the Licha study created by Derek Rose in the description, which I found extremely helpful during my study of the Catalan. Before we get ahead of ourselves, let's explore some mainline Catalan, with black responding simply with d5. Whilst we can play a delayed Catalan here with knight f3, planning to expand with c4 at a later point, practically speaking, it makes more sense to begin with c4 immediately, attempting to contest for the center. The open Catalan, classical mainline. Here, black has a few main options to try and combat our central control. Let's explore the possibility of e6. The Queen's Gambit declined. Of course, this hasn't quite transposed into the Catalan yet, but we'll get there eventually. We'll continue with knight f3 here, a natural developing move. We'll mostly plan to castle short in the Catalan, so it makes more sense to develop this knight first. It also defends important central space, which will be integral later on. If black continues with knight f6, we'll play g3, preparing to fianchetto our kingside bishop. Because there is central pawn tension between the c and d pawns, we can expect the diagonal our bishop will rest on to open up in the future. After the natural bishop e7 from black, we play bishop g2, and we have now transposed into the Catalan. Black will then castle kingside, with white following suit on the next move. It's extremely important to understand how to handle the move d takes c4 in the Catalan. Whilst the trade of pawns benefits our bishop sitting on g2, we need to ensure we play accurately here as to not forfeit the pawn. Here we play queen c2 immediately, attacking the pawn and activating our queen. This is the classical variation of the Catalan. Whilst the move knight e5 is also possible and is played at the highest level, it doesn't appear to be an extremely enjoyable position to play. In lines with knight e5, you win a pawn from black, but you trade off your strong Catalan bishop in the process, giving black some serious counterplay. If you like defending tough positions whilst being up a pawn, these knight e5 lines might be for you, but I would recommend the classical variation with queen e2, which is what we'll look at today. At the highest level, black continues with a6 here. You can see how in a sharp opening like the Catalan, we need to swiftly take action regarding the c-pawn. If we aren't precise, black will attempt to play b5 at the right moment. By the right moment, you can see how our strong bishop and black's queenside rook are on the same diagonal. If black isn't careful, that rook can be easily lost. For example, let's explore what might happen if b5 is played now. Here, we don't rush with knight e5, but slowly undermine the pawns with a4. If c6 is played, a takes b5, and knight g5 will follow. Here we're hitting the rook on a8 with our Catalan bishop, and knight d5 cannot block without blundering checkmate. a6 is not possible because the pawn would be pinned after a takes b5, and the only other move that doesn't just hang a pawn is b4. We want to specifically play knight fd2 here, attacking the rook on a8 while simultaneously attacking the c4 pawn with our knight. We don't want to capture the c4 pawn with our queen because bishop a6 would come with tempo. However, instead of b5, black should play a6. Whilst we can reclaim the pawn with queen takes c4, it's more precise to play a4, expanding on the queen queenside and preventing the move b4 from ever being played. You can see how after a move like a4 is played, black essentially has no feasible plan to retain the pawn on c4 and will have to part ways with it. After bishop d7 for black, queen takes c4 is now appropriate as we've minimized all of black's counterplay and conducted this opening phase in a surgical manner. If we explore lines too deep in the Catalan, we could be here forever. But generally speaking, our knight will be developed to c3 or d2 depending on the circumstances. The bishop will develop to g5, and white enjoys dominant control of the h1 to a8 diagonal and the half-open c-file. One important thing to understand is the value of our bishop on g2. If anyone is familiar with the Sicilian dragon, it's quite similar in value to the dragon bishop. If black plays a move like bishop c6 at any point, trying to compete for control of the h1 to a8 diagonal, we mustn't allow the light-squared bishops to be traded off the board. We should instead try and use our other pieces to pry the bishop off the diagonal. We commonly use the knight sitting on f3 to shield our bishop from the trade until we harass black's light-squared bishop off the diagonal. At moments, we should also consider whether or not a hanging rook on a8 is worth the exchange for our bishop on g2. More commonly than you might think, the bishop on g2 for white will be more valuable than a rook on a8 for black. Of course, if you can pick it up for free, you should do it. But if it means the g2 bishop is traded off the board, tread very carefully. The open defense main line. Understanding the dynamics between the move d takes c4 is absolutely imperative in the Catalan. Not only do you need to understand how to handle it in the variation we just looked at, but in any and every move order you must understand the differences. Let's look at the open defense of the open Catalan. It follows the same move order as the previous variation, but goes down an alternate line on move 4, where black chooses to play the move d takes c4. Previously we played queen c2 here, but the move we want to play in this line is bishop g2. Let's understand why. If we immediately play queen c2 here, black will not play b5 defending their pawn. Although our bishop is absent from the a1 to h8 diagonal, we can easily undermine the move b5 with a4. If c6, now we play bishop g2 and black's overextension can be exploited by white. Although this is not a bad option for black, it's not optimal. Instead, they will play a6. If we play queen takes c4, black has used our queen as a catalyst to develop their bishop onto the strong a1 to h8 diagonal before our bishop could get there. b5 will be played, and after queen c2 back, bishop g7 is played. White will struggle to remove black's bishop from this powerful position. But even if we employ the same plan as before with a4, preventing b5, black will continue with knight c6. It looks like there is no difference here. We just reclaim the pawn with queen takes c4, and we've reached a similar position here. The problem is, we haven't developed enough pieces to handle all of black's counterplay. In the previous position, we already had the Catalan bishop, and we had castled. But in this position, after queen takes c4, black will play for e5 ideas, while our king is stuck in the center of the board. The move e5 allows bishop e6, and the white position is swarmed by enemy forces. The reality is, the c4 pawn is not going anywhere anytime soon, and we should focus on developing pieces before reclaiming it. So, after d takes c4 in this position, we play bishop g2. The open defense with a6. Black has multiple options in the open defense. The first is the main line of the open defense, which is the move a6. Although pattern recognition would suggest we play a4 in this position, preventing the move b5 from being played, we actually just castle kingside here. Whilst a4 is possible, it's a slow move in the position and allows black to try and equalize with the move c5. The move c5 from black essentially attempts to blunt white's central control whilst trading off the queens at the same time. In the main line of the open Catalan classical variation, our queen was on c2 when the move a6 was played, so after a4, we didn't need to worry about c5. Now we do. With that being said, white castles on move 6. Whilst we're here, we should also explain why b5 is not possible for black after we castle kingside. Simply put, if b5, we play knight e5. Attacking the rook on a8 with our Catalan bishop. If c6, we do not want to take the free pawn as it allows black easy access to neutralize our Catalan bishop. An example of this would be knight takes c6, queen b6, knight e5, and bishop b7. So instead of knight takes c6, we play b3. If black ignores us, we play b takes c4 and ruin their pawn structure. However, if they play c takes b3, now we can play knight takes c6. Why? Because now we have the dazzling knight a5, rediscovering the attack on black's rook. After rook a7, we now importantly have knight takes b3, which was not possible before. You might be thinking that bishop b7 is now available for black, but now we have the incredible move d5. This pawn cannot be taken because bishop e3 is lurking, ready to skewer black's heavy pieces. If instead of c6, black tries to block with knight d5, we simply play e4. After knight f6 or knight b6, we undermine the queenside pawns with a4. If c6 is played, d4 shreds open the position and black is in trouble as all roads lead to Rome. No matter how the pawn tension is broken, white will win a pawn. Although c6 is not forced after a4, black can try bishop b7, but we still march forwards with a takes b5. After black responds with a takes b5, we play rook takes a8, bishop takes a8, knight c3, c6, and d5 is again shredding open the position in ways that only benefit white. I highly recommend you take a look at these lines with b5 on move 6 yourself, as there are so many hidden gems and resources to explore. Instead of b5 though, let's look at c5 now by black. Here we play d takes c5, and the queen trade is beneficial for us. We can recapture with the rook, and after bishop takes c5, we can play knight e5. Our Catalan bishop is now strong and unopposed, which means our c-pawn cannot be defended without hanging the a8 rook. After black castles kingside, we reclaim the pawn on c4 with knight takes c4, and black's kingside pieces are completely tied down. So instead, black will play knight c6 and continue to develop their pieces. This position is actually quite forgiving for white. Because of white's Catalan bishop, the pawn on c4 is almost impossible to adequately defend now. There are various decent moves in this position, but we'll continue with the sharpest variation anyway, as it's not abundantly obvious. The move here for white is e3. A very counterintuitive move as it blocks in our dark squared bishop, which we previously developed to g5. Bishop g5 is not a bad move here, but it's actually a lot more difficult to play. Black will simply play bishop e7, blocking the pin, and after a move like e3, the following moves bishop e7, knight c3, and knight d5 will be played. Bishop takes e7 and queen takes e7 are essentially forced, and because black has successfully clogged up the h1 to a8 diagonal, the c-pawn strays a little far from reach as a move like b5 is now possible for black as both knights are anchored into the position. The move e3 on move 7 actually sets up a trap for black to fall into. The natural bishop e7 is losing here. After bishop e7, we now play knight bd2. If black plays b5, we dive in with knight e5, attacking the undefended pinned knight on c6. Black has no choice but to play knight takes e5 and forfeit the rook on a8. This is a trade we're okay with, as it doesn't involve giving away the Catalan bishop. If black castles kingside, instead of trying to retain their overextended pawn, we play knight takes c4 and just play with this fantastic position. Where even on pawns, we have a strong unopposed Catalan bishop, and we have the half-open c-file. So for this reason, black will play bishop d7 instead of bishop e7 on the 7th move. We now follow up with queen e2, but the complexities are not over yet. Black can still play b5 here, even though based on previous assessments it appears they cannot. Knight e5 is not an option for white here, as after knight takes e5, bishop takes a8, and queen takes a8, whilst we have won the exchange, we've forfeited the strong Catalan bishop for the inactive rook on a8. Black now dominates the light squares around our king, and possesses the bishop pair. We do not want to allow this. If b5 is played, we play the perplexing move b3, seemingly accepting defeat in terms of reclaiming the pawn we lost in the opening. However, the move b3 is anything but. Black has a decision to make here. They can either play something like bishop e7 and allow b takes c4, b takes c4, and bishop a3. In this line, not only will white win the pawn back, but we will do it with initiative, activating all of our pieces in the process and retaining clearly strong positional assets. If they play c takes b3, we play a takes b3, and not only have we opened up our queenside rook, we've also found a home for our dark squared bishop on b2. So after bishop e7, we would play bishop b2. After black castles kingside, it might be unclear how we progress. We're down a pawn, and it's not abundantly clear how we're going to win it back. But as we identified earlier, black's entire queenside is weak. Our Catalan bishop stares down the barrel of the longest diagonal on the board, our rook sees the entire a-file, including the backwards a-pawn, our other rook will shift to the c-file, staring at a backwards pawn on c7, and a pinned knight on c6. Our knights can jump to c3 and e5 respectively at certain moments, and we fully intend on wreaking havoc on this side of the board. Because of our bishop resting neatly on b2 and our dominant control of the central squares with our pawns, black also has to be careful not to abandon its kingside at any moment. We can shift our focus and leave the black pieces scrambling. It must be noted that my brief analysis of this line is not adequate for you to start playing this at a high level. This line is razor sharp and requires some serious understanding of the various intricacies the opening presents. But as we've already looked at this position for so long and have quite a bit more to get through, we'll leave this specific line here for now. The open defense with c5. Taking a huge step back all the way to move 5, black can immediately choose to play c5 here instead of a6. We've explored the consequences of c5 before, but in this position, let's try and understand why we can allow it, and what we'll respond with. Like we discussed earlier, we do not want to play d takes c5 here. We're down a pawn, capturing on c5 allows black to recapture with development, and queen takes d1 would see us lose castling rights. So instead, here we castle kingside. If black plays c takes d4, this is a big mistake already, as we can comfortably play queen takes d4. If queen takes d4, knight takes d4, and we have fantastic activity already. We have first choice to control the open d file. We control the h1 to a8 diagonal with no competition. Our b1 knight can jump to c3, our d4 knight can jump to b5, threatening knight c7 check, our bishop can go to g5, and overall we're positionally better. Not to mention the fact that we will just reclaim the pawn on c4. This position is not particularly sharp, so let's leave it there for now. Knight c6 is black's best try on move 7 instead of queen takes d4. But then we just play queen takes c4, reclaiming the lost pawn, and again, this position is not sharp as we boast most of the qualities we had previously. So for these reasons, on move 6, black will not play c takes d4, but instead we'll try for knight c6. Here we want to play queen a4. We're pinning the knight to the king here, making any capture on d4 impossible. For example, if c takes d4, knight takes d4, and if queen takes d4, we play bishop takes c6 check and win the exchange along with a pawn. Although we forfeit the Catalan bishop and the light squares, black's poor activity means we can make this concession. So instead, bishop d7 will be played by black, breaking the pin and setting up some nasty discoveries. But we immediately sidestep this by playing queen takes c4, picking our pawn back up. Black can uncork b5 here, because queen takes b5 walks back into the discovery of knight takes d4, which is winning for black. In the case of b4, we sidestep to d3 with our queen. We don't really want to go to c3, because 60% of master games end in a draw with queen c3, as the pawns become symmetrical and the games become dull. After queen d3, c4 will kick the queen all the way back to d1, and from here, white's game plan is a lot less sharp and free-flowing. There are 3 main ideas to understand. If rook c8, we play knight e5. If knight takes e5, we play d takes e5, and black's remaining knight is displaced significantly. If the knight is allowed to remain on e5, we continue with other common plans in the position. If bishop e7, instead of rook c8, we play a4 and try to undermine black's queenside structure. If bishop takes a6, we've successfully split the pawns. And if a6, we play a takes b6, rook takes a8, queen takes a8, and knight e5 transposing. If a6 instead of bishop e7 or rook c8, we play knight c3 and develop normally. Rook e1, e4, knight e5, a3, a4, and bishop g5 are all potential moves in these kind of positions. Open defense with knight c6. Knight c6 is a real possibility in the open defense on move 5 for the black pieces, so let's explore how we should be handling this. We take a unique approach immediately with the move queen a4. This pins the knight to the king so the d-pawn cannot be captured. If bishop d7, we simply take the pawn on c4 and we're extremely happy. However, a more accurate line from black is to play bishop a5 check. Here, we play the obvious bishop d2, blocking the check, and preparing to recapture with the knights. Black wants this trade to happen on their own terms though, and will make progress with knight d5. We continue by playing bishop takes b4, forcing knight takes b4, and proceeding to castle. If you're feeling adventurous, you can play a3, b5, queen takes b5, knight c2 check, king d2, bishop d7, king takes c2, knight takes d4 check, knight takes d4, and bishop takes b5, and play this position down a queen. It's actually equal on evaluation, but seems impossibly difficult to play. But for everyone else that isn't Magnus Carlsen, you should probably just castle kingside. Rook b8 can now be played by black, which is a resource black will revisit at later stages of this video. The idea is to prepare the move b5. whilst not endangering the rook on the a1 to h8 diagonal. In response, we want to play knight a3, attacking the c4 pawn and holding the b5 square. If black plays a6, preparing b5, we dive in with knight e5. If bishop d7, we can just play knight takes c6. If bishop takes c6, we win the free knight on b4, and if knight takes c6, we sweep up the pawn on c4 with our queen. However, if black castles kingside to evade the pressure, we sneak in with queen b5. We're now attacking the c4 pawn and have pinned the b7 pawn to the rook on the other side. The only challenging try from black here is to play b6, meeting queen takes c4 with bishop a6. But here we just play knight b5. The position isn't too sharp for white anymore, and generally we're out of theory here, in a very nice position. Our next goals should be to activate our rooks and possibly target black's weak queenside pawns long term. The open defense with c6. To attempt to neutralize the Catalan bishop, some players may play c6 to try and shut down the diagonal. In response, we should be playing the aggressive knight e5. If c5 is played here, we play the peculiar move short castles. This allows the pawn to be captured two ways, but if queen takes d4, we play bishop f4. g5 doesn't work because of queen takes d4, c takes d4, and bishop takes g5. Queen takes d1 just allows us to take control of the file, so black needs to get creative with knight d5. Here we play queen a4 check though. If bishop d7, we play knight takes d7, and after knight takes d7, we develop our knight with knight c3. Knight takes c3 cannot be played, as after b takes c3, queen takes c3, rook d1, rook takes d7, and rook d1, white is completely winning. If knight takes f4, we play bishop takes b7. Rook d8 is forced to stop bishop c6, and then we continue with e3, knight h2 check, king g2, and we'll pick up the loose knight. Instead of c5 though, the likely move to be played by black is bishop b4 check, which we'll explore some more momentarily. In response to this, we play bishop d2. Black should not capture on d2 and help us develop, so they'll play bishop e7 retreating. We now play e3, defending our central pawn, giving black some interesting options. If they castle short, we'll play knight takes c4 and regain our pawn with a great position. But black can also play b5, allowing knight takes c6, knight takes c6, bishop takes c6 check, bishop d7, bishop takes a8, and queen takes a8. This position is actually good for white, despite having major light square weaknesses. Here, we simply play f3 to shut down the black queen's reach of h1. If black castles short, so do we, and our position is manageable, but black can try some tricks with e5. After d takes e5, knight g4 is a great move from black. We cannot take the knight because our pawn is pinned. So instead of d takes e5, we should castle short immediately, and after e takes d4, we're just up the exchange, and as long as we tread carefully, white should have good winning chances in this endgame. The open defense with b5. At the beginning of the open defense, black may try to immediately hold onto the pawn with b5, a huge mistake. Here, we immediately play a4. If b takes a4, we dive in with knight e5, attacking the rook in the corner. If knight d5 blocking the attack, we play queen takes a4 check, recapturing the pawn with tempo. No matter what black tries here, their position is compromised. I could sit here for 5 minutes and tell you 100 creative ways to dismantle black here, but the position is +2 for white, and this is one of those positions where you're probably just better off bringing up an analysis board and seeing things for yourself. There will be a few moments like this during the video where you literally have to let the chess speak for itself. If c6 instead of knight d5, we still play queen takes a4. If knight d5, we transpose, and if bishop b7, knight takes c5 will suffice. The threat being knight a5, forking the bishop and the c6 pawn. Note that if at any point it looks like black is holding on, they're not. White can afford to make multiple slow moves in this position as long as they're progressive and add fuel to the fire. Again, this position is so dynamic, and I highly recommend you see for yourself, as I can't possibly go through everything in a timely manner. The open defense with knight bd7. In the open defense, there are moments where it could be enticing for black to play knight bd7 instead of more typical moves. We thematically continue with bishop g2, but after d takes c4 and short castles, it's not uncommon for black to lash out in the center with c5. Whilst we're here, we should also explain why b5 is not possible for black after we castle kingside. Simply put, if b5, we play knight e5, attacking the rook on a8 with our Catalan bishop. Hilariously, if rook b8 is played to step out of the way from the bishop, knight c6 straight up wins the queen and the game is over. White has the opportunity to really put the game in a chokehold here, if they can find a few important moves. The first being knight a3. If the tension is broken in the middle with c takes d4, this benefits white after knight takes c4, as it just springs all of our pieces to life. After bishop e7, knight takes d4, and short castles, white has the simple b3, and the game is no longer theoretical. White is just positionally winning. However, after knight a3, knight b6 should be played by black. But this doesn't stop our threat, because we play knight takes c4 anyway. And if knight takes c4, we play queen a4 check, winning the knight back. After bishop takes d7 and queen takes d4, if the tension is broken with c takes d4, we already know this is good for us. But if b5 is played, we drop back to c2. Rook c8 is the only challenging continuation for black, to which we sneak in with bishop f4. If knight d5, we play rook df1 and happily trade off our bad bishop whilst opening up potential firing lanes for our rook on the g-file. However, if c takes d4 after bishop f4, we play queen d3 and our piece activity absolutely dominates black. Not to mention the d-pawn is undefendable. Let's go back a few moves and explore a different idea that black can try with knight bd7. After white castles kingside on move 6, black can try rook b8, attempting to play for b5, whilst not endangering their rook. In this position, we want to play a4, preventing the possibility of b5 entirely. If a6 is played, reinforcing the idea, we shut it down with a5. If b5 anyway, a takes b6 en passant is played, and after c takes b6, bishop f4 develops with tempo and forces the rook back to a dangerous diagonal. The open defense with bishop b4 check. Although the solution to it may feel obvious, bishop b4 check on move 5 for black is actually a lot more complicated than it presents itself. Of course, we will play bishop g2, but what if black plays a5? We clearly don't want to take the bishop as black's control of the queenside becomes overwhelming, so instead we play queen c2. It's extremely important to remember that if bishop takes d2 occurs in this position, we do not play the natural knight b takes d2, we play queen takes d2. If knight b takes d2, b5 will be played and the knight does not make sense on d2 anymore. So with that being said, we take with the queen. If b5 is played now, we swoop in with queen g5 and harass the black kingside. If black castles, we can now take on b5. Instead, c6 will be played, preparing to play the move b5 with some more solidity. So we must prevent the move b5 with the familiar a4. Now if b5, we play a takes b5, c takes b5, and queen g4, again forks the two pawns. So, knight e4 is a decent try from black to provoke the queen into moving away from its strong diagonal. But we simply play queen c2, hitting the knight and forcing black to respond. If knight f6, we play knight a3, preparing to reclaim the c4 pawn. If knight d6, we castle short, with extremely flexible options. If black also castles, we play knight a3, but if they play b5, we play knight bd2, developing some more and keeping knight g5 options open. For example, if after knight bd2, black castles short, we play a takes b5, opening up the long diagonal. And after c takes b5, we have knight g5, threatening checkmate and the rook on a8. If knight takes b5 instead of c takes b5, we simply grab the loose pawn on c4. But after knight d6 and short castles, if black plays knight a6, we need to know the correct move, knight e5. This activates and centralizes our knight into the position. If black castles short here, we again chase the loose pawn with knight a3. But if they play aggressively with knight b4, we retreat back to c1 with our queen. Instead of a5 all the way back on move 6, black can also try c5, which we'll quickly explore. Here, we want to castle short. If bishop takes d2 at any point, we're happy to recapture with knight b takes d2, developing a piece. As in this position, b5 is met directly with knight e5 hitting the rook. If c takes d4 here, we play knight takes c4, and white has a very positive position. However, if they castle short, instead of playing bishop takes d2, we simply want to play queen c1, following previous trends of going after the c4 pawn. If knight c6, we play bishop takes b4. Regardless of what they take with, we play queen takes c4. If b5, we play d takes c5, and if black plays bishop takes c5, we can progress with knight g5, hitting the rook on a8 again. After knight d5, we can play queen c2, threatening checkmate and forcing a major kingside pawn commitment for black. If a5, we play d takes c5, bishop takes c5, and knight e5, activating all of our pieces whilst threatening to reclaim the c4 pawn. Black again has no way to prevent us from reclaiming the pawn, and no way to hinder our development. Now that we've explored the possibilities in the open Catalan, it gets a little bit easier in the closed Catalan. Whilst the theory is still complex, it's far less tactical and much more positional. Contrary to popular belief, I've found the open Catalan to be a lot more theoretical than the closed Catalan, as it feels that various tries from black can be met with the same response from white. This is different from the open Catalan, where white needs to remember several unique resources to hold any kind of advantage. So let's begin with the mainline closed Catalan. The closed Catalan mainline. For convenience sake, we'll start from the beginning again to look at the closed Catalan so we can see the difference between this and the open. After d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight c6, g3, bishop e7, bishop g2, castles and castles, the very identifiable c6 is played. Just before we look at c6, we'll look at the only line to this point that strays away from c6, which is the move knight e4. Knight e4 is quite straightforward to handle. First, we want to begin with knight c3, and if black captures our knights, we happily recapture. f5 is the main try here for black though, clasping down on black's central knight, but here we just play knight e5 ourselves. After c6, we play f3, kicking the knight away. If black plays knight d6, we play c takes d5, and break with e4. However, if they take on c3, we play b takes c3. After this, black can try to remove our knight with knight b d7, but here we play bishop f4, insisting that one of our pieces remains in the black position. If knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, and d takes c4, we can now play e4 and break in the center. But if black plays bishop d6 instead of d takes c4, we play bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and f5. Black cannot take our pawn on c4 because we'll respond with a4, and ensure b5 is never possible because of our Catalan bishop. In any other open Catalan line, d takes c4 would be played in order to deal with the central pawn tension. This opens up the position on the long diagonal, hence the open Catalan. However, in the closed Catalan, black chooses to reinforce the pawn tension as opposed to break it, leading to a much more closed position. Whilst black does still break pawn tension at moments in the closed Catalan, it's much less common, and slow positional build-up occurs first. The plan for white in the closed Catalan is to break for e4 and bring our dark squared bishop onto the a1 to h8 diagonal. So after the move c6, we can begin preparing for this pawn break by playing queen c2. Queen c2 prepares to connect the rooks, whilst shifting the queen over to a preferable square. The queen now supports e4 and reinforces the c4 pawn. If at any point d takes c4 is played, we take with the queen, and this largely transposes into the open Catalan with similar ideas to follow suit. However, the likely move here from black will be to play b6, preparing to put the locked light-squared bishop on the long diagonal, anticipating the central pawn tension to be broken. Our plan here doesn't change though. We play knight bd2, voluntarily blocking in our dark squared bishop in order to support not only the c4 pawn, but the e4 pawn break. Note that we are happy to block in our bishop, as we intend on developing it to the a1 to h8 diagonal. Black has a few options here. Let's explore the possibility of c5 first. Here we just ride the pawn tension and play b3. As things stand, no matter how black breaks the pawn tension, we have positive recaptures. If knight c6, we play bishop b2, and again, black cannot break the pawn tension in a way that hurts us. However, it is important to note that if knight takes d4, and c takes d4, we should first play c takes d5 to open up the strong diagonal for our Catalan bishop, and avoid bishop a6 complications. Although c5 is the best move, it's extremely unlikely to be played, and 77% of masters play bishop b7. The ideas are largely the same here though. b3 and e4 are both entirely acceptable moves, but considering we've already looked at b3, paired with the fact that most of black's moves transpose anyway, we'll look at e4. If after e4, black plays c5, which again is rather unlikely, but theoretically the best move, we play e takes d5, and c takes d5. After bishop takes d5, we harass the bishop with knight b3, threatening to trade off the bishop pair. If the bishop retreats, knight fd4 pins the pawn to the bishop on b7. But if knight a6 is played, we simply win the bishop pair. However, as mentioned, after e4, the most popular move is knight a3, but here our plan is simple. We just play a3 to prevent the knight from progressing further. If c5, we trade the pawns in the exact same order, and even though black can play knight takes c5 this time, we strike with b4, preparing to fianchetto our bishop with tempo. If after e4, black plays knight bd2, which is a fairly popular move, we simply play e5, knight e8, and c takes d5. White is extremely happy here, and can continue by rerouting the knight on d2 to c3, playing rook e1 and activating the dark squared bishop. The closed Catalan with bishop b4 check. Instead of playing bishop e7 on move 4, black can recycle an old idea we looked at in the open Catalan and play bishop b4 check. Our response here does not change. We block with bishop d2, and if the bishops are traded, we recapture with knight b takes d2. However, bishop e7 is the likely response from black. They've provoked our bishop into moving, and now fianchettoing it will be tricky as it's no longer on its home square. For now, this is a problem for later, so we continue with natural developing moves such as bishop g2, with both sides castling kingside to follow. After the thematic c6 from black, we play queen c2, but this time after the move b6 from black, we want to play rook d1. Rook d1 is a massively unconventional move and seems strange without explanation. The idea is simple. We don't really plan on pushing for e4 in this line. Whilst we might play it much further down the line, putting the rook on the same file as black's queen prevents the pawn tension from being broken in specific ways. Let's explore some of the ways black can continue to highlight this. First, if knight bd7, we play bishop f4, giving the bishop some purpose on a decently active diagonal. After bishop b2, we can dive in with knight e5. This does allow black to play knight h5 though, attacking our bishop. Although it may look like we're going to repeat moves, we're happy to play bishop d2 here. If black plays a nothing move like queen c8, we play natural developing moves like knight c3 and prepare for a move like e4 now. However, if black attempts to hinder our progress with knight hf6, appearing to repeat moves, we play c takes d5, breaking the tension on our own terms. Black is forced to play c takes d5 here as to not blunder the c6 pawn, and once they do, we play knight c3, forking the queen and the bishop and forcing one of the bishops off the board. Although we're left with a weird bishop on d2, this is still positive for us, and the game plan is easy. Black can choose which bishop it'd like to trade off, but in reality it doesn't matter. We'll take either bishop. Instead of knight bd7 on move 9 though, black can try the natural bishop b7. But here, our plans are a lot simpler. We play knight e5, and we're transposing into the knight bd7 line. If knight bd7 now, we play c takes d5 and win the bishop pair again. Let's quickly go back to bishop b4 check though on move 6 and explore the possibility of bishop takes d2 check further. Here, like we said, we recapture with knight b takes d2. After black castles short, we play bishop g2 and can expect black to play knight bd7. Here we'll play queen c2, and it'll be quite clear why black trading our bishop wasn't so accurate. After something like b6, we can immediately play e4. This is because black developed our knight to d2 for us, and have allowed us to support the pawn break. Black taking either the c or e pawn results in a loss of central control. If they try to ignore our center here, let's say with bishop b2, we simply push e5, and white is obviously doing well here. Going back again, instead of bishop takes d2 on move 5, black can recycle an old idea again from the open Catalan with a5. We ignore this though, and play bishop g2. Black's best option is to retreat back to e7 with their bishop, and if they do that, we're mostly transposing into things we've already looked at. If they play d takes c4, however, we play queen c2. If this position looks familiar to you, it's because we've transposed into the open Catalan. Here, after bishop takes d2 check, we play the important queen takes d2, and the familiar b5 cannot be played to support the pawn because of queen g5 on the following move. The last idea we'll look at in terms of bishop b5 check in the closed Catalan is the follow-up of bishop d6 after bishop d2. Our plans do not change much here, and we continue with bishop g2, c6, queen c2, knight bd7, short castles, and this time we play bishop g5. Black has essentially forced our hand in terms of what we can do with our dark squared bishop. It cannot fianchetto, the h2 to b8 diagonal is occupied, so that leaves us with bishop g5. We essentially want to get rid of the bishop in this line. For example, if h6, we play bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, and knight d2. We still want to deploy the plans of e4, but we just play this middle game without our dark squared bishop. For example, if b6, e4. Similarly, black cannot take the pawn either without giving us an advantage. If they don't act, we're also threatening e5, forking the two pieces. This results in black either taking on e4 and giving us what we want, or bishop e7, e5, knight d7, and rook f c1. The closed Catalan with g6. Another try black can opt for in the closed Catalan is the move g6. The intention is obvious. Black will develop its bishop to g7 as opposed to sitting around on the a3 to f8 diagonal. Again, our first few moves don't change too much here. Bishop g2, bishop g7, short castles, and short castles. However, here is one of the moments where we will play knight c3. Typically, we play knight bd2 here to support e4 while simultaneously defending the pawn on c4. But if d takes c4 in this position, e4 is extremely strong for white as black has no real way to neutralize white's central control. Instead, they should play knight c6, but here we play knight e5. Black doesn't want to take us here because after knight takes e5, d takes e5, knight g4 and f4, the fianchettoed bishop is completely out of the game. Black also doesn't want to be captured, so they play knight e7, allowing us the luxury of queen d3. Queen c2 is also completely fine. The general idea is to get our queen off the back rank and allow a rook to occupy the d1 square, which would x-ray the black queen. We continue with standard plans here. Rook d1, bishop g5, b3, and a4 are all ideas here. The position is no longer theoretical, and white has multiple good moves they can run with. The closed Catalan with knight e4. The last good variation for black in the closed Catalan is knight e4 on move 4. After bishop g2, black will play bishop b4 check, and the idea is abundantly clear. If we block the check with the bishop, they'll take with their knight and win the bishop pair. So instead, we play knight bd2, and don't give them this opportunity. We don't mind blocking in our dark squared bishop as we can always develop it on the a1 to h8 diagonal. After short castles, and knight c6, we play the thematic queen c2. Black will likely trade off everything with knight takes d2, bishop takes d2, bishop takes d2, and queen takes d2. If black plays d takes c4, it directly transposes into the open Catalan. The Catalan King's Indian Defense. Of course, there are better ways to approach playing the King's Indian Defense than to play the Catalan. However, in a lot of cases, if you've been using the Catalan, the middle games and endgames can be a lot more comfortable if you're using an opening you're familiar with. So let's look at how we can take on the King's Indian Defense with the Catalan. The King's Indian Defense with c5. The King's Indian begins with d4, g6, c4, bishop g7, knight f3, d6, g3, knight f6, bishop g7, castles, and castles. Black's idea with d6 is to support either c5 or e5 pawn advances. It's a very flexible move, and the player with the white pieces must know how to handle themselves if either occur. Let's begin by exploring the possibility of an early c5, as it's quite comfortable for white and one of the easier lines. As early as move 6, black can attempt to make this pawn break with c5. However, we can just play d5 and ignore this proposed pawn tension. In an ideal world, knight c3, e4, and rook e1 are magically on the board and we have a perfect setup, reminiscent of playing against the Benoni. However, black will try and get us into unknown territory here by playing b5. b5 is something we cannot ignore. We need to play c takes b5 or we'll be worse. The good news is, c takes b5 is advantageous for white by half a pawn. After c takes b5, black will play a6, offering the pawn in exchange for some activity. We should bite their hand off here and accept the pawn with b takes a6, and after knight takes a6, we continue with knight c3, preparing to play e4. If black plays bishop f5, stopping the move e4, we play knight h4 to kick the bishop away and proceed with ideas of e4 anyway. This position is pretty simple to play, so I won't go on about it too much longer. If you'd like to explore the position more, it's basically a version of the Benko Gambit where white was given an extra tempo, or a version of the Benoni where white was given an extra pawn. The King's Indian Defense with e5. Playing against e5 is one of the tougher lines we'll look at here. It's a lot more sound than c5, and white has to be extremely sharp to retain any kind of advantage. Instead of c5 on move 6, black will not play e5, but develop some more pieces to support a potential pawn break in the center. Knight bd7 will be played by black. Note, black does not want to play knight c6 to avoid d5 complications. Bishop f4 also allows knight fd2, preparing e4, so black most likely won't play this either, as it's somewhat difficult to play with the black side. After knight bd7, we should respond simply with knight c3, developing whilst supporting the center of the board. Here is where black is comfortable enough to strike with e5. We cannot play d5 here, as it surrenders the c5 square. A knight landing on c5 would result in a knight landing on e4, stopping us from ever playing e4 ourselves. So instead, we fight fire with fire and push e4. If e takes d4, knight takes d4, and we still hold the majority of central space. Playing for white here is not incredibly sharp because of the way we've set things up. We've taken black down a line where they cannot deploy their typical King's Indian ideas, but in exchange we've allowed their King's Fianchetto to be one of the most powerful pieces on the board. It's crucial to play h3 at some point to prevent anything from landing on g4, but apart from that, this line allows for a lot of creativity from white, and as long as you keep an eye on the strong bishop from black, you should enjoy a comfortable middle game. The King's Indian defense with b5. The last unique pawn break black can try, and maybe the most difficult one to deal with, is the b5 pawn break. We follow the same sequence of moves as the other variations, until move 6, where black plays knight c6. We briefly looked at this previously, suggesting black might not want to play this to avoid the move d5. Whilst d5 is a good move here, it's also not going anywhere, and we can play it shortly. But let's begin with knight c3 first, to prepare e4 ideas alongside it. Now, if black switches up the plan and immediately strikes with e5, we just play d5. Knight e7, e4, and knight d7. Black intends on playing f4 here, so we need to know how to stop it. First we play queen e2, and if f4 immediately, we have knight g4 planning on forking the heavy pieces with knight e6. If knight c5, then we just play b4. Knight takes e4, knight takes e4, f takes e4, and knight takes e4. Whilst black has the open f-file, we have complete control over the center and major attacking chances with things like bishop g5 and c5. If black plays h6 before f4 to stop our knight from invading, then we just play knight h4, and now the knight guards the f4 square too, and f4 is not possible. If g5, we play knight f5, and if knight takes f5, e takes f5, and our pawn is a thorn in black's side. However, if black doesn't go for this e5 plan, they'll play a6, preparing the move b5. Here, I recommend just playing d5 and making the commitment centrally. If knight a5, we play b3, whilst being very cautious of black's fianchettoed bishop. Black is slightly too slow to take advantage of this strong diagonal, and before they can do anything, we play bishop b2 and fight for it. Catalan, the Slav and Semi-Slav. The difference between the Slav and the Catalan is that the light-squared bishop is developed outside of the pawn chain for the black pieces, whereas in the Catalan, it stays inside of the pawn chain. The Semi-Slav, however, is a lot more similar to the Catalan because the light-squared bishop stays inside of the pawn chain. However, the main difference is that light-squared bishop will break out onto the h3 to c8 diagonal and will not be fianchettoed. With that being said, let's explore the Slav and the Semi-Slav defense. The Slav defense with knight f3. Generally, the Slav begins as early as move 2, after d4, d5, c4, and c6. Black reinforces the center immediately instead of playing e6 first. This allows black to develop the bishop outside of the pawn chain. We continue with knight f3 and knight f6 being played for both sides. Although this is not in typical Catalan fashion, I would highly recommend playing knight c3 as opposed to the immediate g6 here. If we play g6, black develops their light-squared bishop outside of the pawn chain with ease. However, if we play with knight c3, bishop f5 loses the game to queen b3. The only response here from black is queen b6, and after c5, queen takes b3, a takes b3, and something like knight e4, we play bishop f4, and our position is much better. We have full central control, all of our pieces are active, and we have the open a file. If instead of bishop f4 they play d takes c4, we immediately respond with a4, as to stop the move b5 from defending the pawn. After the natural bishop f4 now, which we cannot punish as convincingly, we play knight e5. The top move of queen e7 is absolutely impossible to find unless you know the theory for black, but if they do play it, we continue with g3 to fianchetto the Catalan bishop. And if our knight is ever provoked, we'll reclaim our pawn on c4. If they do not find queen e7 though, and say for example play knight a3 trying to sweep around to the c7 forking square, it's too slow and we play e3. Although knight b4 looks like an unstoppable threat, bishop takes c4 is an excellent trap. If knight c7 check, we play queen takes c7, and if bishop takes c7, bishop takes f7 is checkmate for white. However, if black plays a more natural move instead of knight a3, like e6, we play f3 and prepare to play e4, which is quite dominating for white with extremely easy game plans. The Slav defense with bishop f5. Black can attempt to force this bishop f5 move on us though by playing bishop f5 on move 3 instead of knight f6. This is bad for white though, as we can now play c takes d5 advantageously. After c takes d5 in return, we play queen b3, and we're hitting two very awkward pawns. If bishop c8 trying to guard everything, we strike with e4, and there are multiple ways to win because black cannot play d takes e4. If they do, we play bishop b5 check, bishop d7, knight g5 threatening checkmate, knight a6, bishop c4, e6, and d5, shredding the position open. Knight f6 is a better try for black, instead of bishop c8, because if we play queen takes b7, bishop c7 is played, and in England gambit fashion, the rook will kick the queen away from the file for active compensation. Instead, we should strike centrally with e4. If d takes e4, we dive in with knight e5, threatening to checkmate. This essentially forces knight takes e5 and d takes e5. We're now threatening bishop b5 check again, and black cannot develop any of their pieces. For example, if rook c8, bishop b4 check, bishop d7, castles, bishop takes b5, queen takes b5 check, queen d7, and queen b3, black has no easy way to continue developing, whilst white has clear progress to make at the expense of a pawn which they will easily win back. If bishop takes e4 instead of d takes e4, we can now play queen takes b7, safely forking two pieces. Rook c8 immediately loses to bishop b5, and queen c8 loses to bishop a6, and the queen cannot be captured without walking into another fork. Importantly, if bishop takes f3 here, we play queen takes c8 check, rook takes c8, and bishop takes c8, going up the exchange and allowing black's bishop to take our pawn. The Slav defense with bishop g4. Bishop g4 is another interesting try on move 3 for black to try and develop the bishop outside of the pawn chain, but after knight e5, the bishop is actually forced all the way back to the home square. If bishop h5, queen b3 again, and we're just forking two pawns here. It's also important to note that queen b6 is not a valid defense because of queen h3, forking the bishop and the c1 square. If knight f6, queen c1 check, queen d7, and then just queen takes b7 is winning for white. If bishop d7 instead of bishop c8, we cannot play queen b3 because now queen b6 is available and queen h3 doesn't fork anything. Here, we just play knight c3, and our plans are largely the same as if we were facing bishop f5. If d takes c4, we can play e4 immediately, now as b5 can never be played because of our active knight. If a regular move like knight f6 comes from black, we play d takes c5, because no matter which way they recapture, we play e4 with fantastic tactical ideas. I highly encourage you to put this position in your own analysis board and explore all of the tactical ideas, because there are just too many of them to go through, but so many lines are winning for white. The Semi-Slav defense. In my opinion, the Semi-Slav is a much less theoretical variation for black, and although it might be slightly uneventful for the black side, it's definitely a good option for them to be playing. The Semi-Slav occurs with e3 on move 3, blocking in the light-squared bishop temporarily. In the case of the Semi-Slav, I actually recommend going for the typical Catalan setup, as it's much more effective than the regular Slav, and has potential to transpose into regular Catalan theory anyway. So on move 4, let's play g3, preparing to fianchetto our bishop. The only real difference between the Semi-Slav and the Catalan is the fact that black does not want to fianchetto their bishop along the a8 to h1 diagonal, but keep it on the c8 to h3 diagonal. We can continue here after knight f6 with bishop g2, and generally black has a lot of choices here already. None of black's options are particularly threatening. As I mentioned before, the Semi-Slav is uneventful for black, and realistically we don't need to look at too much theory here. The ideas almost mirror the closed Catalan, with queen c2, knight c3, knight d2, and b3 all being respectable options for white. The open Semi-Slav defense. The one thing we do need to look at is the open Semi-Slav. This occurs if black plays d takes c4 at any time during the regular Semi-Slav, reminiscent of the open Catalan. Immediately after d takes c4, we want to play knight e5. This is to prevent b5 from being played, as now we're attacking the c6 pawn. We also hit the c4 pawn now. In saying this, if black plays really any move, we can play knight takes c4, and we control the entire center. Any Slav line where we force black to play with this pawn structure will generally be good for white. Again, as I said, the Semi-Slav is not theoretical. However, for that exact reason, it's quite popular for players that want to avoid Queen's Gambit or Catalan theory. White has the majority of the winning chances, whilst having an extremely easy game plan. Just don't reinvent the wheel in these Semi-Slav positions. As long as you remember the key theory we've briefly looked at, any natural moves will probably retain a strong advantage for white. The Catalan Tarrasch defense. The Tarrasch defense is technically an extension of the Queen's Gambit, but if you're playing the Catalan, it's going to be something you need to familiarize yourself with. It's a lot more intimidating than it looks, and it stems from d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, and c5. However, black can also play knight f6 before c5, and after white plays g3, they can play c5 on the following move. Let's look at both options separately. The Tarrasch defense with 3 c5. The Tarrasch defense is quite similar to the Austrian variation of the Queen's Gambit declined, and although it's an unpopular approach, we should still learn how to handle it. We want to begin with c takes d5 here. Black is forced to capture with e takes d5 to avoid knight c6 developing with tempo. After they recapture, we play g3, and as you can see, this intimidating approach from black settles nicely for white. We're essentially playing a regular Catalan, except we don't ever have to worry about our c-pawn dropping off the board because it doesn't exist. We must remember to swiftly castle to avoid any unnecessary checks, but generally white has a lot of good ideas. For example, if black plays knight c6, we just play bishop g2. And after knight c6, we castle kingside. Something useful to remember though is to not take on c4 until black moves their bishop. We want black to waste a turn moving their bishop, capture on c4, and force them to move their bishop again. If black takes on d4 themselves, we'll take with our knight, and our Catalan bishop springs to life. We'll never capture on c6, but we'll keep our knight in the position until they do something about it. Generally, the Tarrasch defense is not sharp nor massively theoretical. The way I see it is that it's a great way for black to get white out of theory at the expense of slightly less play. The Tarrasch defense with 4 c5. We should also look at the line in which black delays the move c5 by 1 move. After knight f3, they play knight f6 themselves, and wait until we play g6 to play c5. This is a slightly better approach from black, but our plan does not change. We play c takes d5. If e takes d5, we transpose into the previous variation. However, black does have the option of knight takes d5. In response to knight takes d5, we should kick it away with e4, taking the entire center. After knight f6 from black, we simply respond with knight c3. We're not worried about c takes d4 at all, because after queen takes d4, and knight takes d4, we have clear plans to play knight b5, threatening knight c7 check. If black defends this with a6, we're just so far ahead on development after bishop g2. Not to mention, we have e5 breaking open our Catalan bishop with tempo. Black really can't do anything but take on d4 either. If they play anything else, for example bishop e7, we play d5, and we have massive control over the black position. This is a position where I highly encourage you to put it on an analysis board and play around with some moves to show just how razor sharp this can be for black. The Catalan Grunfeld defense. Playing against the Grunfeld defense can be extremely intimidating, as it's somewhat infamous for being very theoretical. But this is a common misconception people make about the opening, because it's not really theoretical for white, it's just very theoretical for black. Essentially, black needs to know all of the theory, whilst white's game plan is very straightforward. The differences between the Grunfeld lines is where black decides to play the move d5. Typically, Grunfeld players will play the move d5 on move 3, 5, or 6. So let's take a look at each of them individually. So after d4, knight f6, c4, g6, and knight f3, let's look at the Grunfeld defense. The Grunfeld defense with 3 d5. The earliest feasible opportunity for black to play d5 in the Grunfeld is on move 3. This line is considered suboptimal and is not the main line of the Grunfeld, but can and will still be played by black. The reason it's suboptimal is because white will just take the entire center after c takes d5, knight takes d5, and e4, kicking the knight away. If black retreats the knight back to f6 after being kicked, we do not overextend the center with a move like e5, but continue with natural developing moves like knight c3. After bishop g7, bishop c4, and even though we have allowed black to castle, at the right moment we will in fact play e5, forcing a move like knight fd7. The attacking potential in a position like this is unimaginably vast for the white pieces, and we're already +1 here. If you want a cheat code to this position, just look to force h4 and h5 on the board, and black is completely hopeless. Instead of retreating the knight back to f6, black should have played knight b6, which is slightly better. Here we throw a4 on the board, trying to harass the knights. For example, if bishop g7, we play a5, forcing knight 6d7. From here, we just develop the same way we did when black played knight f6 as their retreating move, playing moves like knight c3 and h4, h5. If black stops our pawn in its tracks with a5, we don't have an immediate threat on black, so we need to play a slow move to ensure black does not get the opportunity to equalize. h3 is the move we're looking for, making it impossible for black's light-squared bishop to develop. If we allowed bishop g4 to be played, black would happily give up the bishop pair to fix their position and slow down our attack. But even going back all the way to move 4, black doesn't have to immediately take our pawn with knight takes d5. They can play bishop g7, which is the better option. We want to play queen a4 check if this happens. If c6, we capture the pawn, and although we give black some development, it's not enough to justify being down a pawn, as we have quick moves like knight c3. If knight bd7, we continue with knight c3, and now black will just never get their pawn back, and we'll quickly play for e4. If bishop d7 though, we play queen b3, defending the central pawn, and attacking the weak b7 pawn. d5 on move 3 isn't a very good try for Grunfeld players, so let's explore the possibility of d5 on move 5. The Grunfeld defense with 5d5. d5 on move 5 is the main line of the Grunfeld, and by far the most challenging try for black. 3. Bishop g7 is played, allowing us to play g3, preparing to Fianchetto our Catalan bishop. Black will castle short, allowing us to play bishop g2, and finally they strike for the center with d5. Unlike our previous line, we want to play c takes d5 here, but after knight takes d5, we do not want to play e4. Whilst e4 is not a bad move, it's not going anywhere, and the superior move is to castle kingside for now to open up more dynamic possibilities later without worrying about our king's safety. Black responds by playing knight b6, anticipating the move e4, which we still do not want to play. If we play e4 now, black will play bishop g5, exploiting the pinned knight and trying to remove a defender of the d-pawn. We simply continue with the natural knight c3, which would support any potential e4 push. After knight c6, we now play the move e3, which looks extremely counterintuitive. e4 looks like the move we should be playing for, and e3 just blocks in our bishop. The reality is, pushing for e4 whilst black is prepared for it just results in us having weak pawns for black to attack. Dominating central space against something like the Grunfeld is only beneficial if it gives you immediate attacking possibilities. In our case, it gives us immediate weaknesses. The good news is, black has no more progress to be made in the position. If they play rook e8, we continue to improve our position with h3, making sure the bishop can never develop. But a move that we always want to be on the lookout for in these positions is d5, which is the immediate way to combat black's best move in this position, e5. If black moves the knight out of the way, we just play e4, and the bishop is completely neutralized on g7. We have complete central control and a fantastic position. However, if black finds the countershot of e4, we want to play d takes c6. If e takes f3, we play queen takes f3, and suddenly we're better and winning a pawn. If queen takes d1 first, rook takes d1, and then e takes f3, bishop takes f3 will still see us go up a pawn and be marginally better. Realistically, this is black's best try in the Grunfeld. If black does not follow any of the moves we've laid out here, know they've made a mistake. The Grunfeld is extremely sharp, and black failing to follow even a single move of theory probably gives white a good move to take the advantage. The Grunfeld defense with 6d5. Finally, let's look at the most delayed variation of the Grunfeld, with d5 occurring on move 6. The full line to get to this point should look like d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, g3, short castles, bishop g2, knight c2, short castles, and d5. It's very helpful for memorizing theory against the Grunfeld that we always want to take on d5 no matter when it's played. In this line, black cannot ignore the capture and reclaim the pawn later because their knight on c6 is under attack, so they must play knight takes d5 here. Unlike the early d5 we previously looked at, we also want to play e4 now. It might be confusing as to why in one line we don't play e4, but in the rest we do. It basically depends on whether or not e4 can come with tempo or not. If there is no piece to kick on f6 when we want to play e4, it's too slow and black can punish. The knight should go back to b6 here, and in this line, because we've castled, we can go ahead and kick the knight again by playing d5. Black has castle too, so there's no early tricks to pick up material, meaning we have to play positionally now. After knight a5, we need to play queen c1 first to tie the knights together. Black has no way to defend the knight otherwise. After either knight goes to c4, we can continue by playing knight c3 and play with an extremely dominant and straightforward position to play. The main idea here is to play b6. Let's say after c6, b6. If knight d6, e5 expands in the center with tempo and neutralizes the bishop. And if knight e5, knight takes e5, and bishop takes e5, we play bishop h6. If rook e8, we play rook c1, and black has major holes in their position, along with a lack of central control. If they play bishop g7, we happily trade, and black has the same issues. This position is +1 for us. So now that we've looked at most of the potential lines in the Catalan, it's time to give it a rating. First, let's start off with effectiveness. The open and closed Catalans yielded extremely favorable positions in the games I played with them. Even if we just look at them theoretically, there's not really a surefire weapon black can use against it. Using the Catalan against the Slav and Semi-Slav was also extremely useful. Whilst I feel we went off the beaten tracks in terms of building a Catalan setup against these openings, generally speaking I had good results with the setup we went through. The Tarrasch is quite uncommon, and I didn't really get an opportunity to play it as much as I would have liked, but I played the Austrian variation of the Queen's Gambit declined myself, so a Tarrasch structure is something I'm quite familiar with. It doesn't seem like the best try in my opinion. It felt like the move c5 comes too late and white has a straightforward response to it every time it happens. Playing the Catalan against the Grunfeld also felt extremely effective. Maybe at the Grandmaster level you'd feel differently, but White's plan is so unbelievably easy against the Grunfeld. We can go for the same setup every time, and White has all of the attacking chances in the opening and early middle game. I spoke to a few King's Indian players whilst I was studying the Catalan, and they all said they hated playing against the lines we showed in the video. Whilst it's not incredibly aggressive, eventually Black just runs out of decent progress to make and has to sit around waiting whilst White gets exactly what they want. Overall, if we're rating the Catalan on effectiveness, I would give it a 9 out of 10. Now let's look at entertainment value. If we're going on entertainment value, of course an opening like the Catalan will never be as fun as a tricky gambit, but it's certainly a lot more eventful than an opening like the London system. The closed Catalan is quite boring to play, and so is the approach we took for the King's Indian defense. There just isn't a lot of room for creativity in those two approaches we took. However, if you wanted to, you could absolutely change the approach you take against the King's Indian. The most enjoyable lines against the King's Indian are certainly the opposite side castling ones, and with the Catalan setup, that just never happens. Everything else was extremely enjoyable to play though. There are so many positions where White is going to have fruitful options, and the games rarely trade off into symmetry by force. The closed Catalan and King's Indian certainly take this rating down a few notches, but generally speaking, I would give the Catalan a 7 out of 10 on entertainment value. Now let's talk about the theoretical difficulty. The theory wasn't too difficult in the Catalan, but I can see a lot of lower rated players struggling to remember it all. The open Catalan was much more theoretical than I was expecting, and it requires you to know the opening from front to back to play it accurately. Whilst the other openings like the closed Catalan, Slav, Semi-Slav, Grunfeld, and Tarrasch weren't so theoretical, the open Catalan certainly makes up for it. Because the open Catalan is such an integral piece to the Catalan, I'm going to give the theoretical difficulty an 8 out of 10. There are certainly harder openings to learn, and if the English attack in the Knight of Sicilian is a 10 out of 10, I feel like rating the Catalan an 8 out of 10 is only fair. Overall, I would definitely recommend the Catalan to anyone over the rating of 1800. Whilst you could practically play it at any level, to play it with any amount of confidence requires you to be going on an advanced player. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. I spent over 24 hours studying the Catalan and another 10 hours putting this video together, so if you did enjoy, feel free to like and subscribe. If this video is well received, I would be more than happy to continue this series. Whichever comment has the most amount of likes, we'll look at in the next video. Other than that, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.